The candles in the dining room at Dunmore House had been lit for precisely the right effect. Tall beeswax tapers in silver candelabra, their flames casting a warm, even glow across the mahogany table, the crystal, the porcelain edged in cobalt and gold. 22 guests had been invited. Sera counted them as they entered, because she had not been consulted on the list, and she wished to know how many people would witness whatever her mother-in-law had arranged for the evening. She was not kept waiting long. The Dowager Duchess of Dunmore stood at the head of the table as the guests found their places, her posture a monument to breeding and intention. Lady Eugenia Mallory was 63 years old, silver-haired, exquisitely dressed in deep plum silk with a high lace collar, and she had not once, in the 9 months since her son's marriage, referred to Sera by her correct title. "Mrs. Wickes," the Dowager said, her voice carrying the precise distance required to reach Sera without appearing to raise it. "You will find your place beside Mr. Alderton. I believe you will have much to discuss. His late wife was a solicitor's daughter as well." A murmur passed through the guests. Not of shock. The Dowager was far too skilled for shock. It was the murmur of recognition, the slight intake of breath that accompanies witnessing someone placed exactly where they have been placed, and understanding why. Sera's seat was 7 places from the head of the table. The Duchess of Dunmore, which she was in law and in fact, had been seated below the wife of a baronet, below the widow of a naval captain, below 2 women whose husbands held no title whatsoever. She'd been seated in her own home, as if she were a guest of no particular importance who had wandered in from the street. Piers was watching. Sera could feel the quality of his attention from across the room, not the heat of anger, not yet, but the stillness that preceded it. He stood near the fireplace with Lord Ashmore, a glass of claret untouched in his hand, and his eyes moved from his mother to his wife and back again with the careful deliberation of a man who is measuring something. Sera sat. She unfolded her napkin. She turned to Mr. Alderton and asked him about his garden, because Mr. Alderton was 71 years old and had won 3 prizes for his roses at the Chelsea Physic Garden exhibition, and he would talk about his roses for the entirety of the first course if she gave him leave to begin. She gave him leave. The soup was served. The fish was served. Through it all, the Dowager presided from the head of the table, not the foot where a dowager ought properly to sit when the new Duchess was present, and directed conversation with the ease of a woman who had been doing so for 35 years. She addressed every woman at the table by her correct title. She inquired after children and estates and health with warmth and specificity. She did not look at Sera once. It was not cruelty of the kind that left marks. It was cruelty of the kind that left the victim wondering whether she had imagined it, whether perhaps the seating had been an honest error, whether the form of address had been a simple lapse, whether the Dowager's failure to introduce her to Lord Ashmore's wife had been mere forgetfulness. It was the cruelty of a woman who understood that the most effective wound is the one the wounded cannot quite name. Sera named it. She had been naming it since her wedding day, when the Dowager had worn black to the ceremony and told 3 separate guests that she had not been consulted. She named it and set it aside and ate her fish and listened to Mr. Alderton described the particular soil composition that had produced his prize-winning maiden's blush, and she did not allow a single flicker of recognition to cross her face. This was what it cost. She had understood that from the beginning. She had met Piers Mallory, the Duke of Dunmore, in the offices of Hargrove and Symes, solicitors, in a narrow room overlooking Chancery Lane on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Her father had been dead for 4 months. The estate, such as it was, a modest house in Hertfordshire, a small library, a collection of legal texts that had been his life's work, was tangled in a dispute with a distant cousin who claimed the house had been promised to him verbally. Sera had come to resolve it. She had brought every document her father had ever signed, organized chronologically, cross-referenced with his correspondence, and annotated in her own hand. Piers had been there on an unrelated matter. He had been waiting in the corridor when she emerged, and he had heard, through the thin walls of a solicitor's office that had not been built for privacy, her calm, precise dismantling of the cousin's claim. He had heard her cite 3 precedents by name. He had heard her pause, once, when the solicitor suggested she might wish to have a gentleman present to speak on her behalf, and he had heard the quality of the silence before she said, very quietly, that she believed she had been speaking on her own behalf for some time and saw no reason to stop. He had introduced himself in the corridor. She had curtsied. Loss had not deprived her of manners, and he had asked her to walk with him, and she had said no because she did not know him, and a woman who had just lost her father and her house did not walk with strange dukes in November, however civil their manner. He had come back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and on the fourth Tuesday she had walked with him, and he had asked her about the legal texts, and she had told him about her father, and he had listened with an attention so complete and so free of performance that she had understood, with a certainty that preceded language, that this man would not require her to be less than she was. They married quietly, in the chapel at Dunmore Park on a gray morning in February. 14 people were present. The Dowager was not among them. She had sent a letter, 3 sentences long, expressing her inability to attend due to a complaint of the chest. The complaint had not prevented her from attending Lady Forthington's card party the following evening, but Sera had not expected it to. Now, 9 months later, the campaign was fully established. The Dowager had moved from passive resistance to active architecture. She controlled the social calendar at Dunmore House. She maintained relationships with every significant hostess in the ton. She wrote letters, and Sera knew about the letters because servants talked, and Mrs. Bolden, the housekeeper at Dunmore Park, was a woman of fierce loyalty who had watched the new Duchess repair the estate accounts with her own hand and had decided, within a fortnight of the marriage, where her allegiance lay. The letters said what letters of that nature always say. They said it with regret. They said it with concern for Piers. They said that the girl, and they always called her the girl, was of good character, certainly, but that good character in a solicitor's daughter was rather like good weather in March, pleasant while it lasted, but not something upon which one built a house. Sera knew about the letters. She did not tell Piers. This was the decision she had made early, and it was the decision that cost her the most, because she understood, as a solicitor's daughter understands the architecture of agreements, that the Dowager's campaign could only succeed if it operated in silence. To expose it would be to force Piers to choose between his wife and his mother, and Sera would not be the instrument of that rupture. If he chose her, the choice must be his own, arrived at through his own observation, or it would poison everything it was meant to protect. So she managed the estate through Mr. Tully, the steward, who reported to her each morning in the small study she had claimed at Dunmore Park, a room the Dowager had never used and therefore could not object to. She kept the household accounts. She oversaw the tenants' welfare. She read to herself in the library after supper, and she wrote letters to her father's old colleagues, and she planted a rose garden in the south-facing walled enclosure that had been neglected for a decade, and she waited. The dinner at Dunmore House ended as dinners of that kind end, with port and conversation separating the men and women into 2 rooms, and Sera finding herself in a corner of the drawing room with Lord Ashmore's wife, who was kind but nervous, and the widow of the naval captain, who was neither. "You are very patient," the widow said, not unkindly. "I should not be." "I find patience is generally less expensive than the alternative," Sera replied, and the widow looked at her with a sharpness that suggested she understood more than she had been expected to. In the carriage home, Piers sat across from her in silence for 3 streets. Then he said, "She seated you below Mrs. Clifton?" "Yes." "Mrs. Clifton's husband is a grocer." "A very successful grocer, I understand." "Sera." "I am well, Piers. It was a long evening, and I should like to sleep." He looked at her in the half-dark of the carriage, the street lamp sliding past the window behind him, and she saw in his face the thing she had been watching form for months, the slow, grinding recognition that something was happening in his household that he had not fully seen, and that his failure to see it had been, in part, a failure of courage. He did not press her. She did not offer. They rode the rest of the way, in a silence that was not comfortable but was honest, and Sera watched the dark streets of London pass the window and thought about her father. He would have known what to say. Thomas Wickes had been a man of careful words and exact feeling, a solicitor who believed that the law existed not to create power, but to distribute it fairly, and he had raised his daughter to understand that dignity was not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain dictate the terms of one's conduct. He had died at his desk, a pen in his hand, a half-finished letter to a client on the blotter, and Sera had found him there in the morning light and had sat with him for an hour before calling anyone, because she had needed that hour to learn how to carry what came next. She was carrying it still. She carried it at dinner parties where she was seated below grocers' wives. She carried it in drawing rooms where women who had been her friends a year ago now looked past her with expressions of careful regret. She carried it in the morning room at Dunmore House, where the Dowager's presence hung in every curtain and cushion and arrangement of flowers, an ownership so complete that Sera sometimes felt she was living inside another woman's portrait, permitted to move through it, but never to rearrange it. When they arrived at Dunmore Park 3 days later, Piers went to his study and she went to her garden, and the distance between them was precisely the width of everything she had not said. The escalation came in stages, and each stage was more precise than the last. In January, the Dowager dismissed the lady's maid Sera had hired, a girl from the village called Martha, quiet and competent, who had learned to dress hair in the French style, and who understood, without being told, that the Duchess preferred simplicity. The Dowager did not dismiss her directly. She spoke to Mrs. Bolden about economy, about the number of servants the house truly required, and Mrs. Bolden, who was loyal to Sera but who had served the Dowager for 30 years and understood the architecture of power in a great house, had been forced to carry the message. Martha was let go with a reference. Sera said nothing. She dressed her own hair for a fortnight until Mrs. Bolden, with a firmness that surprised them both, hired a replacement without consulting anyone. In February, the Dowager's correspondence campaign broadened. Lady Styles, who had been warm to Sera at a musicale in December, ceased calling. Mrs. Pemberton, whose husband sat on the same committees as Piers, returned Sera's invitation to tea with a note so brief it barely qualified as courteous. The social world of London was not large, and the Dowager had spent 35 years mapping its every current and tributary. She knew which friendships could be redirected with a word, which alliances depended on her continued favor, and which women would follow her lead simply because following was easier than thinking. In March, she withheld the household keys. This was not a metaphor. At Dunmore House, the keys to the silver closet, the linen press, the wine cellar, and the still room were held on a ring by the mistress of the house, and the Dowager had kept them since her husband's death. When Sera asked gently whether the keys might be transferred, as was customary upon a new marriage, the Dowager had looked at her with an expression of mild surprise and said she had not realized Sera was familiar with the household inventory, and perhaps it would be best to wait until she had acquainted herself more fully with the contents before assuming responsibility. Sera had acquainted herself fully with the contents within a week of her arrival. She had inventoried the silver, the linen, and the wine cellar, with the thoroughness of a woman whose father had taught her that knowing what you possess is the first condition of managing it well. She did not say this. She withdrew the request. She managed through Mr. Tully and through Mrs. Bolden and through her own quiet industry. And she waited. The formal escalation came in April. Mr. Raith, the Duke's solicitor, requested a private audience. He was a careful man, precise in his language, loyal to the Mallory family for 20 years, and he sat in the Duke's study with his hands folded on his case and told Piers in measured terms that the Dowager Duchess had approached him 3 weeks prior with a request. She had asked him to investigate whether the marriage could be challenged. On what grounds? Piers asked, and his voice was very level. On grounds of misrepresentation, Mr. Raith said. The Dowager believed, or claimed to believe, that Sera had concealed debts belonging to her late father, and that these debts constituted a material deception that might, in the eyes of the ecclesiastical courts, provide grounds for annulment. "Are there debts?" Piers asked. "There are not, Your Grace. I investigated thoroughly before your marriage, as you will recall. Miss Wickes, the Duchess, disclosed everything. Her father's estate was modest, but entirely clear. My mother knows this." "I believe she does, Your Grace. I believe the inquiry was not intended to succeed. I believe it was intended to be known. She asked me to write to 2 other solicitors for their opinion. Those solicitors have wives. Those wives have correspondents." Piers sat with this for a long time. Mr. Raith waited, because he was a man who understood the weight of what he had just laid on the desk between them. "What else?" Piers said, and it was not a question. Mr. Raith opened his case. He laid out 7 letters. They were copies. He had obtained them through channels he did not specify and Piers did not ask about, and they documented a correspondence spanning 6 months. The Dowager had written to Lord Pemberton, to Lady Styles, to the Bishop of Hereford, to 3 members of the Ton whose influence shaped invitation lists and social standing, and to the editor of a society column who published under a pseudonym. The letters did not libel Sera. They did not need to. They expressed concern. They mentioned her birth. They noted the swiftness of the marriage. They wondered, with the particular delicacy of a woman who has spent 6 decades learning how to wound without leaving evidence, whether the Duke had been quite himself when he made his choice. Piers read every letter. He read some of them twice. Then he set them down and looked at the window for a long time, at the late afternoon light falling across the park, at the line of elms his grandfather had planted, at the walled garden where his wife was, he was almost certain, kneeling in the soil with her sleeves rolled above her elbows, doing something she loved in the only space she had been permitted to claim without contest. "Thank you, Mr. Raith," he said. "I shall need you tomorrow. Bring the formal registers." Mr. Raith nodded. He did not ask what for. He had served the Mallory family long enough to recognize when a duke had stopped deliberating and started acting, and the shift in Piers's bearing, the settling of weight, the lowering of the shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that came over him, told the solicitor everything he needed to know. That evening, Piers did not come to supper. Mrs. Bolden brought a tray to his study and found him writing. He wrote for 3 hours. She brought fresh candles twice. The second time, she saw the letters from Mr. Raith spread across the desk, and she said nothing. But when she returned to the kitchen, she sat down heavily in her chair and pressed her hands together, and was grateful, privately and fiercely, that someone had finally told him. In the morning, Piers rode to London. He did not tell Sera he was going. This was deliberate, not deception but protection, because what he intended to do could not be undone, and he did not wish her to carry the weight of having been consulted. If it was to be his act, it must be wholly his. She must never wonder whether she had influenced it, or worse, whether she had failed to prevent it. He arrived at Westminster in the early afternoon. Mr. Raith met him at the entrance to the House of Lords with the documents prepared. A formal declaration, drafted in the precise legal language required by precedent, witnessed and sealed, ready for entry into the parliamentary record. The chamber was not full. It was not a day of significant debate. A matter concerning canal rights in the Midlands had drawn perhaps 40 peers, most of them half attending, some reading correspondence, a few dozing in the manner of elderly gentlemen who had eaten well at luncheon. Lord Ashmore was present, as Piers had known he would be, because Ashmore sat in his place every session day, regardless of the agenda, out of a principle he had never adequately explained, but which Piers suspected had something to do with his late father. Piers waited for the canal debate to conclude. He sat in his place, the Dunmore seat, held continuously since the creation of the title in 1672, and he waited with the patience of a man who has spent 9 months watching his wife exercise a patience far greater than his own, and he understood, in the waiting, what it had cost her. When the speaker called for any further business, Piers rose. The chamber shifted. 40 men looked up from their correspondence and their drowsiness, because the Duke of Dunmore did not often rise, and when he did, it was generally worth attending to. "My lords," he said, "I rise to enter a formal declaration into the record of this House." A clerk moved to the table. Mr. Raith in the gallery leaned forward. "I, Piers Mallory, Duke of Dunmore, do hereby make the following declaration before this House and its assembled members, to be entered into the parliamentary record, and to stand as a matter of public and legal fact." He paused. Not for effect. Piers was not a man given to theatrical pauses, but because what he was about to say would travel from this chamber into every drawing-room, every club, every society column in London within the week, and he wished to say it with the precision it deserved. "My wife, Sera Mallory, Duchess of Dunmore, née Wickes, is my chosen partner in marriage, in estate, and in all matters pertaining to the Dunmore title, lands, and legacy. I name her my sole heir and executrix, with full authority over the Dunmore estate and its holdings, to be exercised in her own right through such stewards and agents as she sees fit to appoint. This declaration supersedes any prior arrangement, any competing claim, and to any challenge, present or future, to her position, her authority, or her standing. I make this declaration freely, without duress, in full possession of my faculties, and with the certain knowledge that no woman living is better suited to bear the name I have given her. The silence that followed was of the particular quality that only a very old chamber, filled with very old men who have heard a great many things, can produce. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of recognition, the silence that falls when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone present understands that they have witnessed it. Lord Ashmore was the first to move. He inclined his head once in Piers' direction, a gesture so small that only those watching for it would have seen it, and so deliberate that those who did see it understood it completely. The clerk recorded the declaration. Mr. Raith exhaled. Piers sat down. He did not remain for the afternoon's business. He walked out of the chamber and through the corridors of Westminster and out into the spring afternoon, where the Thames was brown and busy and the light was very bright, and he stood on the steps for a moment and breathed and understood that he had just done the single most public thing a man of his rank could do in the single most public arena available to him, and that it was, at last, enough. The Dowager heard before supper. Lady Ashmore, Lord Ashmore's wife, a woman of efficient correspondence, wrote to her within the hour, and the letter arrived at the Dowager's London house by hand. Sera would learn, much later, that the Dowager had read the letter in her private sitting room, set it on the table beside her tea, and said nothing for a very long time. She did not rage. She did not weep. She was not a woman who did either of those things. She simply sat with the knowledge that her son had done the one thing she could not undo, in the one place where undoing it was impossible, and that the name she had carried for 35 years now belonged, irrevocably and publicly, to a solicitor's daughter from Hertfordshire. Piers returned to Dunmore Park the following day. He found Sera in the garden, as he had known he would, kneeling beside a bed of white roses that had just begun to open in the late April warmth. She wore her dove-gray wool dress, the one she wore for work, the one with soil on the cuffs that Mrs. Bolden had given up trying to brush clean, and her hair was loosely pinned, and her hands were in the earth, and she looked up at him with the expression of a woman who has learned not to expect things, because expectation is a luxury that belongs to people whose position is not contested. "I have been to the House of Lords," he said. She stood. She brushed the soil from her hands. She waited. "I have made a formal declaration before the peers, naming you, your position, your authority over the estate, your standing as my heir and executrix. It is in the parliamentary record. It cannot be challenged and it cannot be withdrawn." Sera looked at him for a long time. The light was warm, and the garden smelled of turned earth and new growth, and the roses were white against the old brick wall. And she looked at him with an expression he had never seen before, because she had never before been in a position where the thing she had most needed had been given without her having to ask for it, or earn it, or endure something further to deserve it. She did not cry. She had not cried since her father's funeral, and she did not intend to resume the practice in a garden, however moved she might be. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked. "Because I did not wish you to wonder whether you had caused it." "I would not have wondered that." "You would have. Not because you are vain, but because you are careful, and careful people trace their influence on every outcome, and I did not want this outcome to carry your fingerprints. I wanted it to carry mine." She looked at him, and in her looking was the entire weight of 9 months, the dinners, the seating arrangements, the letters she had known about and not mentioned, the title she had been denied and not demanded, the household authority she had been refused and not fought for, the garden she had planted because it was the only ground that was uncontested. All of it was in her face for a moment, visible and unguarded, and then she composed herself, because she was Sera Wickes of Hertfordshire, and composure was the currency she had spent her whole life earning, and she would not devalue it now, not even for this. "Did Lord Ashmore hear it?" she asked. "He did." "Good. His wife writes to everyone." A sound escaped him that was not quite a laugh, something closer and more involuntary, the sound of a man discovering that the woman he has just publicly claimed before the highest authority in the land is, at the moment of her vindication, thinking strategically. "Yes," he said, "she does." They stood in the garden for a while, in the particular silence of two people who have arrived at the same understanding by different routes and no longer need to explain the journey. The roses were opening. The light was gold. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. Bolden was receiving the news from Mr. Tully, who had received it from the groom who had driven the Duke from London, and she was sitting down heavily in her chair for the second time in as many days, and this time she was smiling. The weeks that followed were very quiet, in the way that follows an earthquake, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of rearrangement, of things finding their new positions and settling into them. The letters stopped. Not all at once, the Dowager was too proud for an abrupt retreat, but they thinned, and then they ceased, and the hostesses of London, who had been reading the society columns and hearing the account from Lord Ashmore's wife and her correspondence, began to send their invitations to the Duchess of Dunmore directly, addressed correctly, with her proper title on the envelope. Sera answered them all, promptly and graciously, because she understood that a battle won with dignity must be followed by a peace maintained with generosity, and she had no interest in becoming the kind of woman who punished people for having been uncertain. The ton had been uncertain. They had been given reason to be. Now they were being given reason not to be, and she provided that reason with the same quiet competence with which she had maintained the estate accounts and planted the rose garden and endured 9 months of sustained, precise, elegant cruelty without once raising her voice. The Dowager removed to Dunmore Lodge, the smaller property on the eastern edge of the estate, a handsome house with good light and a walled garden of its own, which Sera had ensured was fully staffed and comfortable before the removal. She did not banish Lady Eugenia. She did not ask Piers to do so. She simply made the lodge ready, and when the Dowager said, one evening over a strained supper, that she found the country air at the park rather too strong for her chest, Sera said she had heard the lodge was very well situated for those who preferred a gentler climate, and the Dowager had looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time in 9 months, something other than contempt. It was not warmth. It was not respect. Not yet. It was the recognition that passes between two intelligent women when one of them realizes that the other has been playing a longer game than she had understood, and playing it well. They did not become close. They were not built for closeness, either of them, the Dowager because she had spent 63 years constructing walls, and Sera because she had spent 26 years learning that walls were sometimes necessary. But they arrived at an arrangement that functioned, and in functioning, allowed the household to breathe for the first time since the wedding. Piers watched all of this with the particular gratitude of a man who understands that the two most capable women he has ever known have agreed to coexist, and that his contribution to this arrangement was to do one thing, decisively, and then step aside. 3 years passed. Dunmore Park bloomed under Sera's careful stewardship, the estate accounts balanced, the tenants well housed, the gardens a subject of admiration when guests came for house parties in the summer. She bore 2 children, a boy called Matthew, who had his father's dark hair and his mother's watchful gray eyes, and a girl called Philippa, who had neither and was entirely herself from the moment she arrived. The household keys were transferred without ceremony on a morning in June, when the Dowager placed them on the table in the morning room and said only that she supposed Sera would wish to have them before the summer guests arrived. Sera took them without comment. She did not thank the Dowager, because thanks would have acknowledged that the keys had been withheld, and both women understood that the fiction of normalcy was the only terrain upon which their new arrangement could be built. She hung them at her waist where they belonged, and Mrs. Bolden saw them there that afternoon and said nothing, but her step was lighter for the rest of the week. The estate prospered. Sera brought to it the same methodical intelligence she had brought to her father's legal disputes. She reviewed every tenant agreement, renegotiated 2 that were unjust, and commissioned repairs to 3 cottages that had been neglected since the old Duke's time. Mr. Tully, who had managed alone for years and had expected the new Duchess to be decorative at best and interfering at worst, found himself working alongside a woman who read quarterly reports with the attentiveness of a scholar and asked questions that revealed she had understood not only the figures, but the patterns beneath them. He began bringing her problems he had previously solved alone, not because he could not manage them, but because her solutions were frequently better than his. The Dowager visited at Christmas and midsummer. She was formal and distant with Sera, and unexpectedly tender with the children, which Sera allowed without comment, because she understood that grandchildren are sometimes the bridge that two adults cannot build between themselves, and because Matthew adored his grandmother's stories about the old days at Dunmore Park, and Sera would not deny him that. Philippa, who was 2 and fearless, once climbed into the Dowager's lap uninvited during a Christmas supper and fell asleep there, and the Dowager had held her for the remainder of the meal without moving, and Sera had watched this from across the table and felt something shift, not forgiveness, which was too large and too simple a word for what lay between them, but the beginning of an understanding that time, if permitted to do its work, could soften what will alone could not. Mr. Raith continued to manage the legal affairs of the estate. Mr. Tully continued to report to the Duchess each morning in her study. Mrs. Bolden continued to run the household with an authority that had been hers long before any Duchess arrived, but which she now exercised for the first time in genuine partnership. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, a Tuesday as it had been in the beginning, Sera sat in the library at Dunmore Park with Philippa on her lap, and Matthew building a fortress of books on the carpet, and Piers came in from riding with his boots still muddy and the smell of autumn on his coat, and he stood in the doorway and looked at them, his wife, his children, his house, his life. "Lord Ashmore asked after you today," he said. "What did you tell him?" "That you were well, that the estate was thriving, that you had opinions about the canal rights legislation he would do well to hear." "I do have opinions about the canal rights legislation. I know. That is why I told him." She looked up at him from the chair, and in her face was the same expression he had seen in the garden 3 years before, the expression of a woman who has been given something without having to earn it again, and who has not quite accustomed herself to the experience. He smiled. She did not smile back. She was not a woman given to reflexive smiling, but she held his gaze, and in the holding of it was everything they had built, the quiet mornings and the difficult evenings and the letters she had not shown him, and the act he had performed without telling her, and the garden and the children and the steady, unglamorous architecture of a marriage that had been tested early and tested severely and had held. The roses in the walled garden were the finest in the county. Sera tended them herself, still, even with a gardener and 2 undergardeners at her disposal. She knelt in the soil in her old gray dress, and she worked with her hands, and she grew things, because growing things was what she had always done, in her father's garden in Hertfordshire, in the contested ground of her early marriage, in the life she had built from patience and precision and the refusal to be less than she was. She had been named, not in a drawing room, not in a whisper, not in the qualified language of social compromise, but before the House of Lords, in the parliamentary record, in words that would outlast the both of them. She had been named by a man who understood that the most powerful thing he could do for the woman he loved was not to defend her in private, but to claim her in the most public way his rank allowed, in a chamber where his name carried the weight of 3 centuries, and to do it without asking her permission, because permission would have meant she had to carry part of the burden, and he had wanted, for once, to carry it all. The Dunmore name endured. The roses bloomed. The children grew tall and watchful and occasionally muddy. And in the parliamentary record, in the careful hand of a clerk who had witnessed a great many declarations and would witness a great many more, the words remained. His wife, his chosen partner, named and claimed and beyond all challenge. They arrive here, like seeds carried on a slow wind, finding ground that has been quietly prepared whenever they are ready.